Good. Okay, well, thanks for joining me this morning, everybody, for our How to Complete a Floodplain Development Permit training. So Tara's here to help me monitor the chat and keep people on mute just to cut down on background noise. But yeah, we're recording this so it can be viewed later on. And so floodplain development permits are kind of the backbone of the NFIP participation for a community because of our obligation to permit all new development. And so I've kind of broken it out into a couple of different steps just to try to clarify the process a little bit. So first of all, we have outreach and education for citizens in the floodplain and just community members so that people are aware that floodplain development needs to be permitted, and then having an adequate permit form. So it's another important document that we have to hopefully serve as a checklist for making sure that we're verifying all the different parts of compliance that would apply to new development. And then having an inter-office review process, because there are other departments in the community that may have some involvement with new development from their side of things, not dealing with the floodplain, but we need to coordinate with them and have that process so that we can have a turnaround time on getting applications reviewed and either approved or denied. And then consultation. So some communities will have a pre-application meeting or just a conversation with potential applicants about the process and what's required. We need to check for completeness, so we can't really start a review until we have a complete application. And then checking for technical compliance, which is really the longest step, is going through and making sure that the proposed development is going to comply with our regulations. And then making sure that everyone's on board with approvals of those other departments, and then we either approve or deny the permit, and we'll talk about the documentation for that. And then doing inspections is another important step that comes in during and after the process. So we will get into all of that. So when is a permit required? So if you look at your ordinance, it will say basically a permit is required for all development. So it's written out in multiple sections, and it talks about any man-made change, any proposed improvement, any development to improved or unimproved real estate, which really covers all real estate. So that means new buildings, changes to existing buildings, definitely substantial improvements, but it also includes temporary structures and accessory structures, which are something that often get missed in the permitting process. Definitely storage of materials is something that comes up quite a bit that doesn't get permitted and it's not properly anchored. So that's something to look out for. Definitely any activities that would include filling, grading, excavation, mining, and drilling. Those are usually larger projects that would definitely need a permit. So permits are required for all projects that meet the definition of development, which again is any man-made change. And so this is why we need to advertise the need for permits. So even if you don't have a flood map in your community, if you participate in the NFIP, you're still required to determine your flood prone areas and then permit that development. So if you do have a firm, of course, this is only applying to your areas of floodplain. And so we do need to do this outreach so that citizens understand that permits are not just for buildings, it's all types of development, unless it's specifically exempt. And so whatever we can do to get this message to people, whether it's having brochures available throughout the community, having community events or being a part of community events or social media, or I think I would just do an annual mailing to those addresses and businesses that might be impacting your floodplains, such as shed companies that do deliveries of accessory structures oftentimes don't consider or include anchoring or flood vents. And so if we at least do that outreach, then people can't really claim that they didn't know about this requirement. So that's part of ensuring that permits are applied for by informing the public that they are required. So doing that outreach is step one. And I think this can help avoid having to take enforcement actions and having people commit violations either by claiming ignorance or actually not knowing that they're supposed to have these permits. Some people unknowingly break the rules and have violations because they don't know. So we'd like to eliminate that. But other responsibilities as a local permitting official, as a floodplain administrator, is understanding your local regulations, because we need to be able to explain all of the federal, state, and local requirements. And so all of that is spelled out in your floodplain regulations. And then, like I said, investigate complaints and enforce violations to get those corrected. And then we process the permit applications, which is what we're talking about today, is having that process in place to ensure compliance and make sure people are applying for permits and then having a decent turnaround time on getting that finished. So again, we might have to work and coordinate with other departments or other staff, maybe like a city engineer or something, to look over all the technical data. That would be a required part of an application package. Then you're also collecting the fees, finding deficiencies and getting them to fix that, approve or deny the permit. You have to schedule and conduct the inspections and then permanently maintain the records of everything that you're doing. In addition to having flood maps available for office and public use, and you might put the floodplain viewer link on your website, and I'll show you that site if you're not familiar with it. And then we're updating these administrative forms as needed and making sure your ordinance is up to date. So if anyone has any questions or interest in updating your ordinance, I would be the person to ask, and I'm more than happy to help you do that. So here's a flow chart of this process. It is a little bit more visual of how this works. So you have an application. So the first thing we're doing is verifying the location, the flood zone map, all of that, the fee, and then reviewing the application for completeness, making sure you have everything and or correcting those deficiencies, and then giving it out to the other departments, having them review it, and then you either approve or deny the permit, have them withdraw it or fix it, and then you're conducting inspections, fixing any violations, and then at the very end of that process, issuing the certificate of compliance or certificate of occupancy. So it's really best to hold off on issuing those final permits and approvals until we've gone through this entire process to make sure that it's compliant before we do that, because it's a better tool than to just give it to them preemptively and then try to revoke it or fix violations after that. It can be a lot more difficult. So the adequate permit form, hopefully clear and direct. So we're going to go over our model floodplain permits that we have. And so each section comes with its own instructions to try to help the person as they're filling it out. And so I do have copies of that if anyone would like to see it. But again, it's revised periodically to stay updated with changes in the community, changes in how your departments work, or any other regulations if you update your ordinance or that kind of thing. And then making sure it tells applicants what technical information and those attachments that need to go along with their permit applications. And that is all specified in the ordinance, such as having a final elevation certificate to verify the lowest floor of a residential or non-residential structure. And so we're specifying these conditions. They sign on to having inspections done. And so having inspections written into the permit form and then they sign it kind of helps you with the whole entering private property issues that can be a problem. And getting that permission, you just make it part of the permit. And again, requiring them to provide a final finished elevation certificate, and that if things don't go according to the specified plans, that the permit will be revoked. And so again, it should serve as a checklist for all of the information that we need to verify for the application. And so here's the sentence that's in our sample permit, is that by signing the application, you agree to allow the community official to have access to the property to inspect the ongoing construction of the project. And so that's our last step that we are going to go over, but you should hopefully be able to schedule several inspections during the process of development. And so basically we have the applicant, our developer's information, our site location, our map data zone, of course, our BFE data, if that's applicable. Not everything is going to need elevation data. So if someone's replacing their driveway slab, it is considered new development. It needs to be permitted, but you don't need all of the elevation data that you would need for a new house in the floodplain. So that's not always applicable, but you should notate what type of development it is, and we have a section for a description of the project in our permit, and I'll show that to you. And then the additional information are the attachments that would go with that, which are the site plans, development plans, elevation certificates. You might require under construction certificates and a finished elevation certificate, depending on your community. No-rise certificates, floodproofing certificates, anything else that you would need, depending on what kind of development it is and what zone it's in. So I did mention exemptions to small projects. So we do have the discretion to exempt small projects because otherwise these things should have permits unless we specifically write that it doesn't need them. So that's where written administrative procedures comes in. They're not required, but they are highly recommended, and it just kind of supplements your ordinance. So things like planting a garden, farming activities that don't significantly change the grade, mailboxes, routine maintenance such as re-roofing. Excuse me, sorry. So re-roofing is something that comes up quite a bit when people are just re-shingling a roof. Technically, that really should have a permit unless it's specifically exempted. And so having written administrative procedures can really flesh out these processes and make it clearer to citizens what's required and what's not. And that way, if you're really clear about it and you have all of these written processes and certain projects that don't need a permit, people won't be able to challenge you that you're making arbitrary decisions, that you're letting some people do things and not others. If you have this document that explicitly states what doesn't need a permit. So the key to this is, would it cause an obstruction to flood flows or alter the drainage or be a substantial improvement? So that kind of thing shouldn't happen without a permit. There shouldn't be a situation where there's a substantial improvement that goes unpermitted. And then FEMA specifically cites in their 480 publication that having a barbed wire farm fence in a floodway could go exempted just because it should rip out of the ground during a flood. And so we just have to think about these things. So a barbed wire fence compared to a large wooden privacy fence, definitely not the same thing. A wooden fence is going to cause an obstruction. And the same thing with chain link fences. We hear a lot that chain link fences will allow water to flow through, but it usually ends up getting clogged with debris at some point. And so that's something we have to think about. Would it cause an obstruction? And then here's a snippet of our written administrative procedures templates, and then I've highlighted the minor exemption where you can add in those small projects. So if you don't have a copy of this, or if you don't have written administrative procedures, let me know, because I really think everyone should have them. And then, as I mentioned, having an inter-office review process where we can coordinate with the other programs and offices in the community that might have to be involved with a new project. So we need to identify what those departments are, health, building, electrical, zoning, whoever else needs to review the work, and then have some kind of routing and sign-off procedure so that we can keep things on time and stay with our turnaround time. Because if we take too long to review an application, people will just go ahead and build without applying for permits. So making sure that the staff understands their roles and follows those procedures, and working in conjunction with each other. So there has been a case where someone got their certificate of occupancy at the same time they got a violation notice from a different department. And so we don't want that to happen. So if there's an issue between different departments, we need to get that clarified before we issue the permits and give all the final approvals. And then, so you'd also need to be able to advise the applicant on other permits that could be required. And then it does say in the ordinance to notify adjacent communities and us of any alteration or relocation of a water course. So that is also part of the process. Okay. And then, yeah, it ties into step 7, which is making sure everyone is on board with the final approvals. So we just want to make sure that we're working with the other departments, and hopefully the regulations between departments lines up. So it's probably easier if you have a full municipal code that's all one document. I have seen that before, but we do have plenty of communities that just have a standalone ordinance. Although it does say the most restrictive regulation will take precedence, just having that kind of alignment and consistency between departments will help. And then, so step 4 is these preliminary steps where we're kind of working with the applicant, because they will often contact you about what's going to be required for a certain project in the floodplain, or get a copy of the application or the ordinance. And so this can be an important step into explaining the requirements to them, and then helping them with maybe parts of the application to prevent any delays or mistakes. So you can make it into a formal pre-application meeting step that you have with them. Or you could just keep it informal and just answer questions and have that conversation as people come to you. But it's a good opportunity to get all this preliminary information out to them, and maybe just like walk them through the process and set up inspections. Because we can't really start the review until we have the full application package together. And so we can just take the step to kind of provide information about missing documents, or whatever is needed to continue with that review or withdrawal of the application. So what are we looking for? So we need to make sure that all the administrative forms are signed and completed. We have all of the building plans or grading and excavation plans. We have to check the property lines. We want to verify that it's in the floodplain, and then check setback lines and easements, topographic information. What's the flooding source? Get an idea of the BFE. So I'll go over calculating a BFE or finding approximate information for that. And if it's prepared by a professional, it should be stamped with their license seal. And I have the website where we can look up people's licenses, and then correct any deficiencies, and then going through our permit records. So going back through their property records to find previous permits so that we can look at substantial improvement for existing structures. And then again, we want to have a set turnaround time to get these back to people, because again, otherwise people may just avoid applying for permits altogether. And of course, the other documents that we will need, and letting them know that these are going to be needed: the floodproofing certificate for dry floodproofing, Enclosures below the lowest floor would be documented on the final elevation certificate, where you have the size of the enclosure and the flood openings. You might need a non-conversion agreement to go with that, just to make sure it's not converted into a living space later on. Approval from your other departments, state and federal permits that may be required for certain projects. And if you're in the CRS program or considering joining the CRS program, having finished elevation certificates that are at least 90% accurate is part of your certificate construction management procedures, and those are reviewed annually. So that's something to keep in mind. And documentation for engineered openings. So they should come with a certificate that's attached to the elevation certificate. So the NFIP and our ordinances require that we verify that all other federal and state permits are obtained. And this can be really confusing for people because they just don't know what agencies might be involved with what kind of projects. And so we don't want to issue our local permit until we have verified this and make sure that the applicant is aware of obtaining these other permits before they start making investments. So making sure that they're aware that they might have to apply for these permits and get these separate approvals before they start spending money on new development. And so again, a good permit form should act as a checklist to make sure that these other permits are obtained. And I'll say again, it's better to hold off on issuing your final approvals until you have all of these things. Sometimes it gets approved on the contingency that the other permits are obtained, but it's better to get them first if possible. So a list of what other permits might be required in your jurisdiction. So having a list maybe on your permit form or something on your permit form that talks about the other types of permits from the other departments in your jurisdiction that might be required for certain projects. And then other common ones is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for any wetland work or work in a navigable waterway, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and the Endangered Species Act. So that's kind of a big one, and FEMA has been emphasizing it for some time. And so we're kind of still waiting on new guidance on that, but if you're not sure, it's better to just get a determination, and it's pretty simple working with the Manhattan field office. So I will go over that information. And then a DWR state permit. So that is our Manhattan office that will issue that permit. So that would be Janelle Phillips. And we often work with her on usually fill in the floodplain, but any kind of stream work or stream obstructions. And I'll go over that a little bit more. And she can give you a determination on whether a state permit would be required. And again, not all projects are going to require these other permits, but all projects need a local floodplain permit. So this is another screenshot from a handout that we have that just kind of summarizes when a state permit is required. So really, any repair of a dam, work on a levee, bridges, culverts, pipelines, like I said, fill in the floodplain, excavation or dredging within a stream. I said work on a levee, yeah. So usually that type of work is what triggers the need for a state permit, but I can give you this handout if you want a copy of it because it is kind of specific. So there are, these size limitations that trigger it. A dam that's 25 feet or more in height, or 6 or more in height with the ability to store 50 feet. So yeah, it's pretty specific. I don't do these permits or anything. I just kind of send people her way. But it is good to have this information so that you have a better idea of when you might need to check for one of these permits. And really, placement of fill in the floodplain is the most common one that we have. And if it's going to be a foot or more of fill, is when that's required. So sometimes certain foundation types can be considered fill. So you might want to get a permit determination if you're not sure. I think it's always just better to check just in case. And I also have this fact sheet that just kind of goes over who you might need to contact about different permits and why. The Kansas Department of Health and Environment is another state agency that we commonly run into, usually for septic tanks and new septic systems going into the floodplain, because they have much stricter rules than the NFIP does on that. So our regulations basically just say that they're not going to contaminate and that they've been placed in a way that is, generally safe from flooding. But yeah, that's another agency that you might end up working with at some point to get permits. So yeah, just another kind of summarization of what types of activities might make you want to check with these other agencies. Public health facilities, definitely anything septic or wastewater related, definitely floodways and regulated streams for sure. Of course, having that conversation with your other departments and that coordination so that you know when they require to do their own permits or inspections or whatever the case may be. Definitely landfill or hazardous materials type of storage or facilities. Definitely any modification to a levee. So yes, we'll just check with those agencies that regulate that type of development. And as I mentioned, the Endangered Species Act is kind of a big one at this point in time. So FEMA has been working through a lot of litigation with different environmental groups after they've been found to not have been doing endangered species compliance. And so they did settle one of those lawsuits last year, just over a year ago in California. And so we're still waiting on new ESA guidance to come out soon because it's not entirely clear. But basically, undeveloped floodplain areas most commonly might contain habitat or these rare threatened or endangered species. And so we are only talking about federal species for this, not state species. So an incidental take permit is what's required if they will be impacted. And so there's a couple of ways to look at the different species that might be in your area, in your community. So that's the Kansas Wildlife and Parks site. They have a list of species by county that you might want to be aware of. And then, as I mentioned, the Manhattan Field Office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is really your main go-to for getting a determination on any endangered species, potential impacts or issues. So there are a couple of tools. IPAC, which is Information for Planning and Consulting, is a website where you can kind of go in, draw your polygon for your project, kind of go over what type of development it is, and then it'll generate a letter that says whether you might impact a species or not. And we've gotten mixed feedback on whether FEMA will accept it. That's kind of common that FEMA reviewers are just a little bit different in how they do things. And so it may just be part of your planning and looking into a specific project that might make things easier to incorporate that information into your planning and to help you save money and time by avoiding delays. And so this is really the official way to get a determination. It's really simple. You just send the Manhattan Field Office an email with a description of the project and then a ferment or a small map that shows them the area, and then they should be able to give you a determination or ask more questions to give you a determination, and then you can save that correspondence as an official documentation that you verify the Endangered Species Act. And so that's the way to go about it. I think IPAC is a good planning tool and it might give you some ideas. as well as the FEMA Fresh Map. So this is flood risk and endangered species habitat. So it's a mapping tool that kind of shows the federal species, their range, and it also has a special flood hazard area overlay. And obviously that's only if you have digital maps. If you have paper maps, we'd have to go look at that, although we did digitize those on our state viewer site. And so that's the link to the fresh mapping tool. So as you can see, this layer is from 2019. In my fictional project area, it looks like there's a milkweed species that could be impacted. And so I might want to ask the Manhattan field office about that. But I really doubt it because we're in like a residential neighborhood area. So again, it's usually undeveloped areas of floodplain, but if you're not sure, I would just check with them. So this is our fictional project and our sample floodplain development permit. So section A is the applicant's information. So we just have the community name, date, application number, and then the statutory authorization in there so that we can cite the state requirements. And then you might want to cite your specific ordinance in here as well. That does say floodplain management ordinance and applicable other city ordinances. So you might want to cite that throughout the different sections. But of course, this is just an example. And so section A, contact information of the applicant, and it says preferred information of the property owner, not the developer. So I am the fictional property owner for a site in Lawrence. And so this is my fictional site. So it's just a city street in Lawrence that is in the floodplain. It's adjacent to the floodway. It's in an AE zone. And so this is 1205 Brook Street. There's nothing actually there on this property. So I'm building a fictional residential building on fill, which isn't too typical of a residential area that I might be pushing water off onto people, but it could be something that you run into. So this is along the Brook Street tributary, which is part of the Kansas River system. So section B is my site information. And so I wasn't actually able to find the legal description for this property online. I'm sure if I actually owned it, I would have, the deed, or a deed would be created for it, or whatever the case may be. So if I was actually the property owner or the developer, I would have that information, but I put in the PLSS information, the section, township, and range. I have the street address, and then I have a little bit of like the tax location stuff. So Douglas County has a property like parcel search website, which is pretty common for counties to have that. So you should be able to find various sources of information to verify the location information. And so of course, Lawrence has a digital flood map. Douglas County has digital flood maps. And so I can find this on the National Flood Hazard Layer, or NFHL. So this is the nationwide version of the site. We do have the state floodplain viewer that has all the same information in it, but there is my site location. You can see I'm between two cross sections. I'm between cross section B and C of the Brook Street tributary. I'm adjacent to the floodway. There's the PLSS information right next to that, as well as the effective date and the panel number for my map information. And so a lot of the basic information that you would need can be found here, or as you make a fermet, which is always good to have with a permit, that you should just go ahead and make one and just keep it with your property files. It's good to have as part of the permit. And so the National Flood Hazard Layer has the firm and some additional layers to choose from. You can also download it into GIS. So again, if you have a paper map, you'd be going to search all products to find your location. And so you'd go search by state, Kansas, and then pick your county and then the community within that county, and then go to effective products. So you can see that at the bottom. And then there's the firm panels and the effective flood insurance study. So if you don't know which panel you need to find this site, then you would open the first effective product, which is the index map, and then this will show you basically a map of all the panels. And then based on these kind of general landmarks in the general area within the community, you should be able to find which map panel you need. And so I have 0178E here, and then you can see Brook Street Tributary is labeled on that. And then you would go into that map panel and find your approximate location. So basically I've just zeroed in on the stream and the street that my site is on, based on these basic landmarks, including the cross section. We know we're in between B and C, which is going to be important for when I'm measuring the base flood elevation so that I can double check that the permit has been filled out correctly by the developer, and that they haven't used like a rounded base flood elevation or something. So it's pretty easy to make a fermet, and you can just keep it digitally or you can print it out. If you print it out, just make sure that you click actual size in the printing settings so that you are preserving the map scale. So this is what it looks like. I think the tool may have been updated, but it looks pretty much the same. You have the full map panel open, and then it asks you to select your page size. Then you just kind of move the smaller green box over your scale and north arrow, and then you have the larger green box for your area of interest, and you just set it up however you like. And then you just, I would save it as a PDF, and then it just generates the map for you. And yeah, as I said, this is just good to do whenever you're working on a project or have the developer make one and send it to you. So yeah, it's kind of just a basic drag and drop process for that. So finding a specific location should be pretty straightforward on a digital map. If you're still using paper maps, as I said, you find the general area, and then you save the fermet, and then you can measure out your specific area so that we can still verify the base flood elevation and the exact location in our exact flood zone. You can just go to Google Maps like I've done here and just use like the center line of the street to measure to that exact location. And then you would have your measurements that way. It is easier to do this in a digital map, but not everyone has one just yet. We are working on getting everyone digital maps. Or you can actually just, like I said, have it printed out and just measure it on paper. Plenty of people do that. So there's a more exact location as I've measured it as a fermet. Of course, my map is digital, but it would be pretty much the same thing in a paper map version. It's just not going to be in color, and it's probably not going to have the digital aerial photo background, but it's really the same process. And then, making sure the vertical datum that you're looking at that and what the developer has provided to you, because we want to make sure that everything is in the same datum. If it's in a different datum, then you could have, several feet off in measurement, and we don't want that. So as I said, if you print it, preserve the map scale. If you're measuring in digital, preserve the map scale. If you're downloading it into a GIS, then you'd want to make sure you're in the right projection so you avoid some of that distortion. But most software and like our state floodplain viewer and the national flood hazard layer, they have measurement tools in there so you can measure by feet. Or like I said, traditional paper measurements. So section C is the type of development and making sure that a finished elevation certificate is required and provided. So it's a checkbox, whatever type of development we're doing. And so I've checked off filling because we're going to put in a fill pad, and then, you know, in this scenario, I would be getting a Lomar F to take the fill pad out. And so that's part of the process. But if we're just building the structure, I'm going to need the structure information. So I do have that in here, and we'll take a look at that. But this is the type of development, and then there's a little description part there where you could write in something. Like I said, a new driveway slab is really easy to permit, but it should have a permit. So that's where you could write something like that in. So again, if I was to check off, you know, grading or excavation or something like that, then that is part of the checklist function where I know if it's that type of work that we might have to look at permits from other agencies. And again, we want to make sure that the finished elevation certificate is attached before you know, we give out all final approvals. And I'm putting in fill, so I know I should probably check with Janelle with the state to make sure if I need a state permit. And so the description is just a regular 1-story slab on grade residential that's going on a fill pad. And I've made that clear here in my section D description. I didn't put in the value of the improvement, although that would be important to document for any future work that I was doing for this project. But that line for improvement is really to keep track of substantial improvement, especially if you have standards for cumulative improvement, then we're keeping track of it over a longer period of time. Okay. And so substantial improvement and substantial damage is an important part of permitting. So keeping track of substantial improvements, which again is 50% or more of the market value. You know, if we're talking about an existing structure and doing work to it, this is kind of where this chart comes in. So this is from the substantial damage and improvement desk reference. And it just kind of breaks down the different types of work that's done to existing structures and whether it's pre or post firm and the type of work that it is, whether it's you know, what's required for compliance. So for example, a vertical addition that's above a building that is a substantial improvement, if it's pre-firm, the building is required to comply, and then post-firm, it should be in compliance, that the work shall comply and then not make the building non-compliant. So this is just kind of a breakdown of how that should work, and I think it's really handy because this is a little bit complicated working with existing buildings. And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, keeping track of the improvement values. And then section E is our map and flood zone information. So I showed you the map panel number, so I've got that there, and the effective date. We looked at the zone, it's an AE zone, not in the floodway. And then again, with the checklist function, it says, is the development in the floodway? No, but if yes, then you need the notarized certificate to go with that, which means having the full engineering study. So, you know, just going through this step by step to look at all the different aspects of the development and how it needs to comply with our regulations. So again, I've located the site here. And so cross sections B and C are going to be really important for our base flood elevation calculation. So cross section C is my upstream cross section, and it's at 826.14 feet. And then cross section B is at 825.4. And so, you know, clearly I'm closer to cross section C than B. And I'll show you that measurement, but our BFEs for the application and for elevation certificates need to be 1/10 of a foot. And so sometimes developers will look at the squiggly line that's right next to the site that says 826 and just put 826, and there's no decimal place for that. And so we want to watch out for that and make sure that they are calculating the BFE for a detailed study area. So that would be using the flood insurance study for that, and then of course shooting the elevations for that lowest floor and stuff. So BFE at the development site, it says 826.2, and I'll go over why it says that, and then elevation of the development site, and then lowest floor of the residential development is at 828.2 in this fictional scenario. And so it's like that because Lawrence has 2 foot of freeboard, which is a higher standard than even the state higher standard, which is 1 foot of freeboard. And that is specified there in the instructions. It says the lowest floor should be at least 1 foot above. So going through and making sure that it complies with your specific standards for your community. So if you have higher standards, that you're enforcing those and making sure that that is compliant. Again, check the datum, make sure everything is being done in the right datum. So it should be the same datum as the map. Otherwise, have documentation that they converted it correctly, because again, it can be several feet off potentially. And we don't want things to be several feet below the base flood elevation or feet below our regulatory freeboard. Okay, and then we do want to double check their base flood elevations just to make sure that we're all on the same page with what the base flood elevation should be, because surveyors and engineers make mistakes. They might not deal with floodplain stuff as often as we do, and it's just kind of doing our due diligence to go through and double check that they've calculated it. You don't see a whole lot of mistakes, but again, sometimes people will use a rounded number and we want to avoid that. So this is our base flood elevation portal. So here you can kind of like go to a site and click around, and then where it says LiDAR value, you can get that approximate number. It's really plus or minus a foot. And so it can just give you a good idea if maybe someone's a good candidate for a LOMA, which is something we use it for often because that comes up so much, or you can just kind of get an idea of the ground elevation. So that is a helpful tool. Again, it's not survey accurate, but you can get an official BFE letter if it's in a zone A. So you can request an official BFE in a zone A, and that will be calculated for you, and they'll send you an official letter, and that can be used in support of a LOMA. So this is what it looks like. You would just draw your polygon outline as close to the building footprint as possible, and then you would submit that, hit save. But otherwise, like I said, you can just click around and get an idea. And so on the bottom, it's in a zone A, and then it shows you the detailed study area. Obviously, the detailed study area, it says use the flood insurance study, and that is how developers should be calculating that. And so it's the flood profiles in the flood insurance study that we would use to calculate for streams and rivers, like my 1205 Brook Street project. For lakes and reservoirs, it's the still water elevation tables. And like I said, BFEs on the firm are rounded, so you don't want to use that. Watch out for that. And so going back to my project site in my building footprint, I want to locate my upstream corner. And so my upstream corner is the one that's closest to cross-section C, because as I mentioned, cross-section C is the upstream cross-section. And so what we're going to do is draw a line parallel as best as I can to the stream profile baseline from my upstream corner. And now I have this line. Again, beware of your projection. So now that I have this intersection with my upstream corner of my house to the profile baseline, and this is a layer in the GIS is the profile baseline, I now take that intersection and I measure the distance from there to my upstream cross section. And I'm doing this in ArcPro, and using the ArcPro measurement tool, I get a distance of 21 feet from the upstream cross section. So I'm going to the flood insurance study, flood profiles, they're in the back of the flood insurance study. And then down at the bottom, you can see B and C. So that's where my house is, right in between those two cross sections. And be aware of the direction of flow is usually from right to left. So the right side is the upstream side. Again, you could see in the GIS and in the data tables that are also in the flood insurance study what the exact base flood elevations are at those cross sections. So B is 825.4 and C is 826.1. Of course, like I said, we're using 1/10 of a foot, so I've got the 1 decimal place there. Again, check your work, just double check everything. We have found some errors before in flood insurance studies in the profiles. It's not very common, but it can happen. So I am looking closer in at the flood profile. So I've got this distance of 400 to 800 feet between these two in the distance of this large square. So I've got 10 smaller squares that break that down so that each small square is a 40-foot interval. And so based on that 40-foot interval, I need to measure a distance of 21 feet downstream from cross-section C. So it's a little bit of a judgment call here and there. You can see it's not exactly perfectly on the line or anything. And so I'm doing my best with the measurement tools to get a line that is about 20 feet downstream from cross-section C. So that's about half of a small square. So I've done my best to accomplish that. I mean, it's a distance of 0.05 inches in that small section, but it should be pretty close no matter what method we're using. Altogether, it should be pretty much the same base flood elevation. And then on the right, I have measured the distance between B and C as 0.4 inches, which works out to be 160 feet, and it matches up in the GIS. Again, we're just double checking everything, making sure that the flood insurance profile is, making sense to us and that all of the measurements are working out. And so I'm really not that far down from cross-section C that you can see it. So I wasn't really able to measure a lot of difference. It still came out to about 26.1. And you are welcome to round that up. So you saw I had 826.2 on my permits, and that's totally fine. We support that if you just round up a tiny bit just to make sure that something is, above the base flood elevation or even just a little bit more. As far as freeboard, having just like a little bit extra is never going to hurt. It makes it a bit safer from flooding. And so on the flood insurance profile, the flood profile, I've just drawn that line up. So my line from cross-section C, I've just pulled it all the way up through the different flood frequencies and then found where that line intersects with the 100-year flood, and that's labeled in the legend, and then just gone horizontally across to see what the elevation is. And then that's how we would double check the base flood elevation. And so again, it should be consistent with the cross-section values. If I got something outside of the range of B and C, then I have probably messed up somehow. And then I would need to go back and make sure to fix my mistake. I have done this before where I accidentally was looking at the wrong stream profile. So it could be something simple like that. And so it kind of makes sense that I would get a BFE of 826.1 because, like I said, I'm only 20 feet down from the cross section. So, it makes sense. And so, again, we want to check that in the elevation certificate, make sure everything is correct, that they have sealed it with their signature and their stamp. A lot of communities will just fill out section B of the form for the surveyor developer. That's the map section, or just give them that information and they'll fill it out, and that just kind of avoids any mistakes. So the Kansas State Board of Technical Professions, that's where you can search someone's license just to make sure that they are properly licensed. And only an engineer or a surveyor can fill out and certify elevation certificates in Kansas. Architects cannot, which is different in other states. So that's something to be aware of. Our current elevation certificate version is going to expire at the end of next month. So after that date, we should be checking back on the FEMA website just to determine in case FEMA has provided a new form, but it usually takes a while for them to come out with a new form. And so that same form will still be valid until such time that they release a new version of it. And again, you have to have the finished elevation certificate for NFIP compliance, but it's now optional for insurance. And then again, once we're sure that everything's in compliance for us, we want to check with the other departments to make sure that everybody's on board with a final approval. And we're doing our elevation certificate trainings at the end of next month. So if you want to check that out. And then step 8 is our just approving or denying the permit, and we're giving our signature over and everything. So when you give your final approval, that's the official authorization allowing the applicant to proceed. Start of construction, as long as it begins within 180 days, otherwise you might have to extend the permit. And then if you do have to deny a permit and they don't want to revise it and they withdraw it, it's good to provide them with a written reason for denial, and just having that explained in writing can help them avoid doing appeals based on your administrative choices. But something to look out for are appeals, special use permits, and variances. So these are really not NFIP things. They're usually governed by state zoning laws, but people do have the right to appeal your decisions. And variances are, I don't know if I'd say the most common, but they're definitely the most pertinent to floodplain stuff, because floodplain variances are taken really seriously by FEMA. So we need to consider the NFIP criteria when we make these decisions, because when it's done properly, very few situations qualify. And I really don't like variances and dealing with them because people, often don't have the justification that's really needed to grant it, which is good and sufficient cause that pertains to the land, not the applicant. Doesn't concern property value or financial reasons, any inconvenience or aesthetic concerns. We're talking about unusual characteristics of the property and a hardship that outweighs the long-term risk to the owners or any future occupancies, and the need to enforce our regulations that protect people from flood danger and damage. So just make sure your Board of Appeals is educated on that criteria. And then our last step here is doing inspections. So optimally, we'd want to do 3 inspections. Realistically, it's like 1 or 2, depending. I hope that you'd be able to inspect it at least 3 times, but that would be, in an ideal world. But basically, the first inspection hopefully is to go out when the project is staked out to check the setbacks and the floodplain or any unintended floodway encroachment thing. We'd want to make sure that it fits with the site plans and that it's going along with the proposed development. And then inspection 2 is probably the most important one. This is when we're placing the lowest floor to make sure that it's at the correct elevation. So you might want to have the developer out there who can shoot an elevation, or somebody on your staff that can shoot an elevation. Or there is a way you can kind of just measure it yourself a little bit, but that's not the preferred method. And then inspection 3 near the completion of the project to kind of determine if there's enough flood openings, if the machinery and equipment is elevated like it should be, anchoring systems, that type of thing. And then ideally you would also do periodic inspections after everything has been approved, just to look for any non-compliant modifications. People often cover up their flood openings because they don't like them, because they let in animals or they make the floors cold or whatever. The non-conversion agreement to make sure that people are not trying to convert enclosures to living space, that kind of thing. Of course, the type of foundation is going to dictate your inspection schedule. So that's something to look at. Obviously, some projects are not going to need inspections if someone is, again, maybe putting in a new driveway slab. But definitely residential, non-residential structures should have that. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. And then we have to keep records indefinitely. You might want to encrypt those records because there's private information. Always keep them on file, have backups. Make sure they're clearly labeled somewhere and filed away safely so that they don't get lost or thrown out. I've been told keeping it geographically organized is the best way to do it. And then there might be permit management software, but I don't know a whole lot about that. But yeah, other than that, if there's questions, let me know. Otherwise, if you want a certificate for this class, please send me an email after this because I don't just automatically make them. Just send me a request for a certificate or any of the other materials or resources that I talked about today.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
so
Cheyenne. Yeah,
yep.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I did answer some direct messages, but I believe I've resolved those. So did anybody else have any questions they wanted to ask? Okay, well, thanks everybody.
Yep. Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day.